Welcome to the very best part of my broadcast week. This will be the last takeout before the 2024 presidential election. I'm not going to tell you who's going to win. I'm not going to tell you what to do with your anxiety, should you have any, about the outcome of this election. But we are going to have a voice that will help you sort through things that can actually be measured, at least partially, right now in this election. And with those measurements, you might be able to, on your own, come to some conclusions about what may or may happen as returns come in and actual vote totals are posted Tuesday night, November 5th. To help us do that, I want to bring in Tom Bonier, who joins us via Zoom from his home here in the Washington, D.C. area. Tom, it's good to see you. Tell my audience who you work for and what your specialty is.
Sure, I'd be glad to. It's great to be here with you, by the way. So I work for a company called TargetSmart. TargetSmart is a democratic data and analytics firm. Basically, we build and maintain a national file of every single voter in the country. And that file has a whole lot of information about each individual voter in terms of their partisanship, demographics, likely turnout. So we work with Democratic and progressive campaigns and organizations generally and help them make decisions about who they're talking to and how they're talking.
So you are a Democrat, correct?
I am. That's right.
The data we are discussing this podcast and TV show, does it have a party orientation?
It does not. The cool thing about this data is it's all publicly available data. It's all verifiable. There are other similar sources out there in terms of Republican counterparts or even some bipartisan elements, but all the data is very transparent. We're just looking at who's voting, who's registering, all from publicly available election sources.
We are recording this, ladies and gentlemen. I always am transparent with you about this on October 30th. So by the time some of you hear this number that I'm going to cite, early vote, more than 50 million, I think 54 million as of this morning, will be higher. Okay. And some of the data points that Tom refers to will shift ever so slightly. So take that into consideration. But as you listen to Tom walk through the data, you can use that as informative information about how the data changes and what you can track yourself. So, Tom, tell my audience what you have concluded, if anything, from the early vote total and what it might mean for an overall turnout modeling or representation for this election.
Yeah, when you think about that number, first of all, can I just say the obvious that it's a very big number, but it's not quite as big as we saw 4 years ago. So with the data we have, we're able to compare to the same point in time, which is really key to this type of early vote analysis. We know that 4 years ago, there was a pandemic. And so credit to the election officials around the country who pivoted heroically to allow people to vote safely during a pandemic. Over 100 million people cast a ballot before election day 4 years ago. That was about 2/3 of all votes cast. 2 years later, in the 2022 midterms, we saw that drop down to 46%, closer to pre-pandemic numbers. So these numbers that we're seeing now that you cite, over 50 million votes, telling us that we're likely going to be above that 46% share. We're estimating at this point, it'll be a little bit over half of all votes will be cast early. So what is it telling us? It's telling us that in case there was any doubt, we do have to remember earlier this year, we thought that perhaps it wouldn't be a very high turnout election. Most Americans weren't very excited about a rematch between Presidents Biden and Trump. Obviously, we've seen that change since Vice President Harris took over at the top of the ticket. There's been a lot of excitement and enthusiasm on both sides. And so this is really the first true confirmation that we're seeing high level of engagements, and we're likely headed towards another very high turnout election. I don't know at this point if it'll break that record that was set 4 years ago, but it's certainly in play.
Would you be surprised if turnout was in the range of 170 million when it's all said and done?
I think 170 million is likely the very high end. I think, the most likely range in my mind at this point is somewhere probably between 155 and 165 million. It's possible, right? If both sides are engaged, we are seeing potentially some new voters being brought into the process based on the events of the past 4 years. So it's in play, but that would be a bit surprising to me.
Tom, do we know anything about those who choose to vote early?
We do. We know a whole heck of a lot about them, actually, because we get every state, or in some cases, county or local election officials, they will provide effectively in real time a list of who's cast a ballot since their last update. Every state is updating at least once a day, some states more than that, some states twice a day. They'll produce a list. And I want to be clear about this. It just tells us that these individuals have voted. It does not say for whom. The secret ballot is sacred. It'll just tell us that this person cast a ballot today. It'll generally tell us how. Did they cast a mail ballot, an early in-person ballot? So we have a lot of data that we can then match that into our existing voter files and have really granular understanding of who voted. We do know that people who vote before election day tend to be older. Certainly during the pandemic, that was different. We saw a lot more young people voting early. A lot of them weren't where they were registered to vote because they were home from college. They were in Zoom classes. But generally, the early voting electorate is older. This year we're seeing an electorate that's also more white than it was 4 years ago.
Do some states provide party registration with this data about early voters?
They do. And so, especially when we think about the 7 battleground states, you actually have almost even mix. So you have 4 of those states that have partisan registration: Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Nevada, and Arizona. And then Michigan, Wisconsin, and Georgia do not. So in those cases, we actually have to model partisanship. It's not perfect, but it allows us to get a sense of the likely partisanship of the individuals are voting, which is important to this analysis. It's not the only thing that we'll look at, but it is an important element in understanding which side potentially has more enthusiasm or is more engaged.
And this is a good time, I believe, Tom, to remind our audience, or maybe they're hearing this for the first time, that they ought to exercise some manner of caution about assuming party registration equals a vote one way or the other. We do know that partisan allegiances are strong in this country. They have been visibly strong for quite some period of time, but you would probably be misguiding yourself if you were to assume every Democrat is voting for Harris and every registered Republican is voting for Trump.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's an incredibly important caveat and reminder. Sometimes people will confuse partisan registration with party identification. And it seems to be, it's a weird thing to parse, I think, to a lot of people, but people will register with a party for various reasons, or sometimes they will not register with a party for various reasons. We've seen more and more people registering as unaffiliated, especially Generation Z. They just don't like to register with a party. The polling data tells us that they vote overwhelmingly for Democratic candidates. But also, you might ask someone a question and they'll tell you they're one party or another. Or they might tell you they're an independent and they could be registered a different way. We're seeing crossover voting in places like Pennsylvania. You have what they call ancestral Democrats, people who have been registered as Democrats for 30, 40 years. But they tend to vote more Republican now because they've shifted along with the politics of our country. You have Republicans in other areas who are doing the same, who might have shifted more recently under the Trump presidency. So very important caveat. We do expect to see not insignificant crossover voting in this election. I think you're seeing it in the polling between the Senate races and the presidential races, where there are a lot of potential ticket splitters out there.
That is the voice of Tom Bonier. We're going to continue to drill down on this data when we come back for segment 2 of the Takeout in just one moment.
They're seeing very big gender gaps. We know since Dobbs, women have been more activated and motivated.
Welcome back to the Takeout. Tom Bonier is our special guest. All right. So, Tom, because I know you know how to do this, I'm going to ask you 2 questions. Look at the early vote. And for someone who is favorably inclined to former President Trump, tell them the best thing that they could see in the early vote. And for someone who's inclined to Vice President Harris, tell them the best thing that they might be able to find within the early vote?
Well, I think what the Trump supporters and the Trump campaign are going to find as a positive in the early vote at this point is really the comparison to 2020, because in the 2020 election, we know that Democrats just dominated the early vote. It was a method of voting that prior to 2020, Republicans really used to their significant advantage, especially in these Sunbelt states like Arizona, Nevada, Florida, Texas, where they would really get out their supporters, especially older voters, quite effectively. And it was frankly the envy of Democratic campaigns. And then we saw this shift in 2020 where Donald Trump convinced his supporters that mail voting was potentially fraudulent, that election day should just be a single day. And what we saw was Republicans basically held a mass evacuation from early voting. And then after the election, you saw a lot of Republican strategists say, look, in this close election, this probably cost us the election. We need to do something about it. And so the Republican Party invested significantly in turning that around. They tested it in Virginia in 2023 to mixed results. But Donald Trump himself has been changing his tune to the extent that that he stays on message on some elements. And this, he's been quite on message, telling people at least that they should vote in the way that they're comfortable. If you look at the Madison Square Garden rally, every speaker was encouraging voters to vote before election day. So they've put a lot into it. And you do see the results. You do see a shift where in many of these battleground states, Republicans are accounting for a larger share of the electorate than they did at this point 4 years ago. In Pennsylvania, that share increase is somewhere between 8 to 10 points. So it's happening. So I think Republicans are looking at that and they're feeling good about it. From the Democratic perspective, there was this expectation that this would happen, that it would shift more Republican. I think a couple things that Democrats are looking at when they see the magnitude of the shift. I think the Harris campaign looks at it and says, well, we expected it to be more Republican shifting to early voting. They look at the Republicans who are voting early and they say, well, look, these are mostly people who voted on election day 4 years ago. They're not generating new voters. And then I think they look at some of the demographics. They're seeing very big gender gaps. We know since Dobbs, women have been more activated and motivated. I think a Harris supporter who looks at this early vote and they see these large 10 to 12 point gender gaps in the early vote. They look at states like Michigan and Wisconsin that at this point appear to be more Democratic than they were 4 years ago. You're not seeing the Republican onslaught yet in those states, and they likely feel good about that as well.
I want to double back on something we discussed in the first segment, which is turnout. And I threw out a number 170 nationally, but then I reminded myself that national number is less important than what the turnout will be in the 7 closely contested states. Do you expect that turnout in those 7 states will be at or above 2020 levels? Because that's really where the rubber is going to meet the road in this race.
Yeah, I'm glad you offered that distinction, because there is an interesting dynamic that's potentially developing, and in the end, we won't know until next week. To state the obvious, we won't know until election day. But what could potentially happen is higher turnout engagement, and that would not surprise me at this point. And in fact, I think that's more likely at this point to see more people voting for a number of reasons. Again, I think the intensity and enthusiasm is actually peaking above where it was in 2020 in these battleground states. You're seeing just, again, this push in early vote, which could add new voters at some point along the way to expand the electorate. And so I think that's an important element. Whereas in some of these non-competitive states or less competitive states, where, to be clear, they still have competitive races. If you're an American, there is a very good chance that you live somewhere where there is a competitive race across the board somewhere. But in states like New York, California, you're seeing less intensity at this point. It's not to say that it doesn't exist, but I wouldn't be surprised if turnout in those states falls short of where it was in 2020, maybe by not an insignificant amount. So that distinction is incredibly important.
What do we know, Tom, about registration overall and registration since Vice President Harris became the successor effectively to President Biden?
So I'm a big fan of digging into voter registration data because when we think about what we know from the polling, it just tells us that it's likely to be a very close race. And so then it becomes a question of voter engagement, intensity, and enthusiasm, everything we've been talking about in the early vote. And the early vote data is helpful, but it has a lot of caveats that we mentioned. Well, the other data set that can be helpful to us is voter registration data, new voter registration. It's looking at not just the raw numbers of voter registration, because we know many states, especially in the battleground, have added something called automatic voter registration, where an individual will automatically be registered to vote. It depends on the state, but generally when they have some interaction with the government, getting a driver's license or something else. So those baseline numbers aren't as interesting as seeing the sort of deviations from the baseline, meaning if we look at the trends in voter registration and we see when they vary, that's telling us something about a group that for some reason is paying more close attention to this election, that they're more engaged, that it's changing. And so if you look at the past year, or I could even expand to the last 4 years since Joe Biden became president, Republicans were having great success in voter registration over most of that time period. They've been investing in voter registration efforts, especially in battleground states like Pennsylvania, North Carolina. And you've seen the result. You've seen them registering more voters. And frankly, over at least the first half of this year, you were looking at typically Democratic constituencies, younger voters, women, voters of color, were really not registering at the rates that they were in 2020. There was a big lag. And frankly, that was something that I think we saw reflected in the public polling data where President Biden was underperforming with these exact same voters. And then after July 21st, when Vice President Harris assumed the top of the ticket and President Biden endorsed her, we saw in this immediate period afterwards these massive increases in registration, in some cases tripling registration rates among those exact same groups. So young women of color were showing the biggest increases, again, over 200% increases in registration relative to the same point in 2020. But broadly, all of those groups, younger voters, women, voters of color, were showing substantial increases. Where you really saw a spike in that first week of Vice President Harris's candidacy. But then after that spike leveled back down, it still was at, the registration rates were at a rate that were much higher than the baseline, either prior to the candidate change or even 2 to 4 years earlier. And that's been sustained really through now. We have to remember that in many states, you can still register to vote. Many states, you can register to vote up to and through election day. And so we're still seeing those high registration rates in those states.
And what do we know is the statistical probability of someone registering right before an election and their likelihood to participate in that very next election?
So we're able to look at this in the historic election data because we can see registration rates for voters. And again, we have the information of who cast a ballot, not for whom. And so we can look at 2020, and what we see is the new voter registrants in the last presidential election turned out at a rate of 83%. So it's a very high turnout rate. That's far above the national turnout of all registered voters. And, you know, these new registrants, again, keep in mind that entire pool includes everyone who registered to vote during that time period, understanding that many of those new registrants were people who didn't actually intend to register. Potentially, they just were getting a driver's license. If we were able to isolate those who are registering as part of these spikes, I'm confident you'd actually see a turnout rate that would be even above that very high 83%.
The voice of Tom Bonier. When we come back for segment 3 of the Takeout, we're going to ask about what these new registered voters may mean to the ability of polls to actually capture where this race is when we come back.
Speaking as someone who has worked in the field of election data and analysis for 30 years now, I can tell you it's very difficult to get that right.
Welcome back to the Takeout. Tom Bonier is our guest, and I hope you have enjoyed and will continue to enjoy what I hope is data-driven conversation. Tom is a Democrat. We've identified that at the top, but what we're working through is the actual data and what you can, perhaps, if you so choose, infer from it or take from it as this campaign draws to a close. So, Tom, everyone sees the polls who's watching this race. Within the polling data, are these newly registered voters likely to appear? Meaning, can pollsters actually find them? And is it possible that the surveys are missing them?
Yeah, so there's actually two elements to this answer. One is just a very functional answer of how pollsters do their work. And I promise not to go too deep into the weeds here. But in the end, almost every pollster at this point is pulling their samples, the lists of who they contact, whether it's an online survey or a cell phone survey or a landline survey, or any other type of survey. They're generally pulling a list, what they call their sample, from a voter file. And what we know is while we get the information that I've been talking about with the early vote effectively in real time, new registration data generally lags. States will update their voter files at very different cadences. And so in some of these states, the file that they'll be working off of might not have been updated in 6 weeks, 8 weeks. And so anyone who is registered in that time period will not be on their list. Some states will update much more frequently, but even those states, I would say the average would probably be at least a 2-week lag. So they're not going to appear there. So there is some argument to be made that when you look at these registration changes, if there is a surge in registration, especially late in the election, that benefits one side or the other, that might not be picked up in the polling. In the end, new registrants will still be a relatively small share of the electorate. It depends on the historic elections, generally somewhere between 7 to 15% of the electorate. But that's enough in a race that's 50-50 in the polls to be able to potentially skew the results or see the results diverge from polling by enough. The other element to consider in this, in terms of these voters being included, is just the question of how the pollsters are approaching this. And even if they are on the list, are they assuming higher turnout from certain groups? And, that's potentially a longer conversation. But in the end, I think most of the polls that we are seeing in the public are taking a fairly safe approach to their estimation of the electorate. They're looking at what happened in 2020 in terms of turnout there. They're likely adjusting for some population changes and saying, here it is. This is our best estimate of what the electorate will look like.
And I've discussed on this program before, Tom, that I believe our industry does a terrible job of explaining to listeners and viewers what polls are really about. We don't spend enough time explaining the difference between registered voters in a poll or likely voters in a poll. But let's talk about likely voters. It seems to me that if a pollster is building a likely voter model, newly registered voters simply are not going to be in there, because unless they're in a state where they have just moved and they were registered before and they voted before, they might be in a likely voter model. But if they're brand new registrants, they're not going to be there, not captured at all.
That's right. Yeah, and every pollster will do this differently in terms of it's something that's half science and half art, building a likely voter model. And unfortunately, there's generally not a lot of transparency in how pollsters do this. And again, they all have slightly different ways of approaching this, but they're making a decision about what they think the electorate will look like. And speaking as someone who has worked in the field of election data and analysis for 30 years now, I can tell you it's very difficult to get that right, because it's not just the conversation you and I were having at the outset about roughly how many people we think are going to vote. For a likely voter poll to accurately reflect what's going to happen, they have to predict accurately the division of the electorate by age, gender, race, ethnicity, educational attainment, ideology. There's so many different important elements that we know deeply impact political decision making. And if your poll doesn't perfectly reflect what actually is going to happen in turnout, we all focus on the margin of error, and we'll say that this poll result is inside or outside of the margin of error. The average poll will have a margin of error somewhere between 3 and 4 points. But that statistical calculation assumes that the pollster has perfectly sampled the likely electorate. And what we know is almost no poll will perfectly sample the likely electorate. And so if the errors and their decisions of predicting turnout are more in favor of one party or another, what we're going to see is the actual error in these polls being potentially substantially more than 4 points.
So I went back, Tom, and I looked at the polls before the 2012 presidential election. That election day was November 6th. There were 14 polls released in our country from November 1st to November 6th. If you averaged those polls, Barack Obama had a 1.6 percentage point lead over Mitt Romney. If you took out 2 of the Democratic partisan polls that were in that matrix of 14, his average lead over Mitt Romney was 0.8%. As you well remember, Barack Obama won that election by 3.9 percentage points. I only bring that up to say that sometimes the analysis can look one way and the result a different way. Should that in any way inform our understanding or expectation about this election?
Oh, it absolutely should. If we fast forward the 12 years that have transpired since then, really this industry of poll analysis and aggregation has changed dramatically. It's exploded in a lot of ways, where you have many more participating in this, which I think in general is a good thing. But really, that exercise that you just walked us through is incredibly instructive, because for a long time there was just a notion that, you know, the axiom in our business is trust the averages. Or when we would see a poll that maybe looked like an outlier, people would generally say, well, just throw it in the averages. And the notion was, well, any one individual poll has a pretty substantial potential to err. It's just the way these things work, for all the reasons I just mentioned and other reasons that I haven't mentioned. But the idea is, well, if we take a lot of good polls and we throw them together in an average, that's going to give us a good result. And generally, that's been historically better than any other method. But what we have found is that we can't necessarily trust these averages, at least to the extent that we used to be able to, because we have to consider the components of the averages. And what we've seen this election cycle, and we saw this also 2 years ago in 2022, is sort of 2 factors happening at the same time. Fewer high quality, nonpartisan public media surveys. It used to be that every big city newspaper would do public polls, and they're very high quality polls. That barely happens anymore. And at the same time, you're seeing a flood of partisan polls. And at this point, the partisan polls are coming almost exclusively from the right, from Republican pollsters. It's something that it's not to say that there aren't partisan Democratic polls. They exist. At this point, the ratio might be 10-1 in terms of Republican to Democratic. So the impact on the averages, or how these different poll aggregators are handling that phenomena, is really going to have an impact on where those averages end up, and therefore our understanding of where the election stands, which is why, even though the polls are generally converging around a very close 50-50 race, if you look at the different sources for aggregation, you're going to see different shades of gray that would favor one candidate or another.
That is the voice of Tom Bonier, and we are going to continue our data-driven conversation. And when we come back, we're going to grapple with 2 questions. One, the euphoria in the Trump world, because they say he's always been underpolled, he always overperforms. That means he's coasting to victory, and what 2022 ought to tell us about what we might expect on election night. That's segment 4 when we come back.
The average poll in 2022 missed the actual result by 4.9 points.
Welcome back to the Takeout. Tom Bonier is our special guest. We've identified him. He's a data specialist. He's a Democrat, but we're talking about numbers. I'm not talking about partisanship. He does that at other venues, not here. So, you know this, Tom. Trump world's euphoric. 2016, the polls missed Trump. He overperformed. 2020, the polls missed Trump. He overperformed. There are all these folks out there that's going to come out of the woodwork. So if he's tied, he's rolling to victory. It's not even going to be close. Evaluate that.
Yeah, and you're right. That does seem to be a fairly popularly held opinion at this moment, not just among Republicans, by the way. I think there are a lot of people.
There's a considerable Democratic freak out about that
Yes.
as well.
Yeah, and in the end, it wouldn't be October without a Democratic freak out. So that's the case. That's the bullish case for the Trump campaign, and it's a real thing. Again, as you said, the polls in 2016 and 2020 did dramatically underestimate Trump support. I think some important context on that, though. In 2016, it happened for a very specific reason. The polls didn't actually consider stratification of educational attainment among white voters, not to, again, to get too deep into the weeds, but it was something that ended up being very important in predicting Trump support. Trump just did so well with less educated white voters and did, frankly, worse with more educated white voters. And what we found was the polls that didn't make a distinction when they were building their likely voter models included too many of the more educated white voters. So they created a picture that just looked better for Hillary Clinton. And in the end, we know what happened. In 2020, the dynamic in terms of the end result was the same, but they had already accounted for that. They had corrected for that problem and then found another problem. And in the end, there actually isn't a consensus on exactly why it happened in 2020. There are various theories. Democrats were more likely to be home because of COVID, therefore more likely to take surveys. So they were overrepresented in surveys. There were different elements of that. But the point is, those two things, the polling industry has worked very hard to correct for those issues. Some believe that they might have overcorrected for those issues. We can look at the history here, and there's not much of a history of polling error being consistent or really correlated to any individual candidate or from cycle to cycle. In fact, what we saw in those two cycles in a row generally doesn't even happen by itself. We can also look at what has happened in the last 2 years, where you've actually seen now polling error in the opposite direction.
Which leads us to 2022. What, if anything, should my audience consider when thinking about what they're seeing before them now and what they saw before them a week before the 2022 midterms?
Well, and I think, for those who are looking to make the bullish case for the Harris campaign, for the polls underestimating the Harris campaign, I think this is key to understanding. Because as we all likely recall, the Dobbs decision that effectively struck down Roe versus Wade, it was handed down by the Supreme Court in June of 2022. And we knew at that moment that it would radically reshape American politics, but we didn't know exactly how. And so 2022 offered that first test of it electorally. And you saw fairly consistently Democrats overperforming the polls, beginning with elections in August. An election on abortion rights in Kansas is the first test. Democrats picking up special elections in the House in upstate New York, winning a House seat in Alaska. And then in the end, the actual November election results, where the fundamentals and the polls predicted a red wave election. They predicted Republicans taking back the Senate, winning significant margins in the House of Representatives. And that didn't happen. It was actually a fairly split election night where Republicans had plenty of things to be happy about, and Democrats, surprisingly, had lots of things to be happy about, overperforming in states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Nevada, and Arizona, incumbent senators and governors winning, in the House ending up very close. The average poll in 2022 missed the actual result by 4.9 points. So outside of that margin of error, and that in my mind is a pretty big miss. We were told after the fact that that was actually a pretty good night for polls, so I guess we need to take that into consideration. Since then, we can fast forward even past 2022. If you look at the Republican primary, what we saw was Donald Trump actually underperforming the polls pretty substantially in Republican primaries. Now, I want to be clear. Primary polling is much more difficult than general election polling because of the questions of turnout. So I wouldn't argue that we should expect to see that carry over into election day this year. But it's another important data point that we have this world of the argument from the Trump campaign that he consistently overperforms polls, and arguments from the Harris campaign and Democrats that while since Dobbs, you've seen Democrats consistently outperform the polls. And so they are both valid points. Either one potentially could be true, and we'll find out on Tuesday.
So, Tom, we've got about 2 minutes left in this segment before we wrap up and then go to the Takeout Outtake Especial. So I want to ask you to do this. Imagine you're at a conference table and the Trump campaign is across from you, an unlikely scenario, I grant you. But tell them the thing they should be most concerned about a week out. And then imagine yourself at a conference table and it's a Harris campaign across the table, the one thing they should be most concerned about a week out.
So I think for the Trump campaign, again, I think when they look at the early vote data, the Trump campaign has built this strategy that's a little bit risky. And I'm not sure to what extent, everyone is aware of this, but we've seen him go on Joe Rogan in the last week. We've seen him go on a lot of these podcasts that are targeted towards younger men. Keeping in mind that the Republican, the campaign here is, they're building out of a 7 million vote deficit from 4 years ago, where they need to change the electorate. So I'm not saying it's the wrong strategy, but we know the strategy of engaging and turning out younger men is a tough one. They're the lowest turnout propensity group out there, and we're not seeing them come out in the early vote yet. Now, maybe they just won't come out in the early vote and they'll come out on election day. But if I'm talking to them about what they need to be worried about, I'd say you got to look at these voters and make sure you have a way to get them out on election day. From the Harris campaign perspective, it's a little bit of the flip side of that coin. As I said before, Democrats dominated the early vote to great success in 2020. There's been a movement away from that among Democrats. And so what it means is the Harris campaign goes into election day needing higher turnout, especially from younger voters, voters of color, women. Now, they feel optimistic about this, I'm sure, because these are the voters who have been engaged and activated since Dobbs, and their expectation is they will come out on election day. But going into election day, that's something. It just means they've got more work to do than they had to do 4 years ago.
And that is the fundamental work of any successful campaign. Not only knowing who your likely voters are, but making sure they are persuaded, activated, and they actually participate. Tom Bonier, it's been a pleasure. Stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen, for the Takeout Outtake Especial. That is next.
Every election has some number of surprises. In this, I think the atmosphere is ripe for potentially more.
Welcome to your Takeout Outtake Especial. If you're here, you want to hear more from Tom Bonier. I know I do. So, Tom, it's election night. What are you watching in those early hours, let's say 7 p.m. to 10 p.m. Eastern?
So what I'm watching, we've been talking a lot about the early vote. And like I said, because we know who is actually voted and we have our partisan models, we have all the information on who they are, which tells us some level of what we expect in terms of candidate support. We talked about crossover voting earlier. There have been a lot of public polls that have suggested that Vice President Harris is potentially outperforming generic partisanship in the early vote. And by the way, I'm not sure I trust that at this point for a lot of the reasons we discussed with the public polling. But one of the first things I'm looking at, many of these states now can count their early and mail ballots before election day. And so what we'll expect to see very soon after the polls close in some of these states, Michigan's a great example of this, is a big dump on reporting the candidate support numbers among those early voters. And so I'll be looking at that and comparing it to our election models to see which candidate is outperforming that generic partisanship. That'll be a very good sign, depending on the degree of the outperformance for whoever is seeing that happen.
What do you categorize in your own mind, Tom, as a potential election night surprise?
Well, in an election like this, where the polls are so close, where we have such a dynamic environment, where you have bases that are engaged, and where you have the sort of questions that we've talked about in terms of potential polling error with the big pro-democratic era in the last two presidential cycles and what's happened since Dobbs that have favored Democrats, I do think we'll see surprises. I mean, every election has some number of surprises. In this, I think the atmosphere is ripe for potentially more. And so, Democrats always at this time of year, we turn our eyes to Texas and Florida. I'll keep maybe one eye on those states to see if there is a surprise in those Senate races. In the House, we know there are always a few surprises. We saw it 2 years ago, but I think we will likely see more surprises in this election than we have in prior presidential elections.
Do you agree with me that North Carolina may be a fulcrum in our understanding of the night?
Yeah, North Carolina, incredibly important. It's one that was a little bit later coming onto the screen in terms of a battleground state, but it has been fully there for months now, at least since Vice President Harris assumed the top of the ticket, kind of similar to Georgia 4 years ago. So, yeah, I think North Carolina is a great one to be watching.
Tom Bonier, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so very much, and have a very good election night.
Thank you.
We'll see you next week, folks.